Okay, we're going to look again into the Natufian culture. The Natufians are somebody that got named for Wadi El Natuf, an area out near Israel somewhat, and it's where they originally found the culture at, but then corresponding sites started happening all over the place, and I believe now they have upwards of 40 sites or something in there. In fact, we'll look at that here in a minute. The reason we're redoing this is because, like the video I showed the other day on oldest humanoid types that there are and their ages and how it has changed, and some more information has been added. Also, here too, quite a few of these sites weren't in the last time, and information that correlates data that eventually comes to conclusions that you and I were making in videos just a couple of years ago, and now it is commonplace knowledge. And to some, whenever I first started saying things like this 20 years ago, I was some type of heretic idiot. And I couldn't make those connections. And of course, before genetics came along, basically we were talking about types of pottery and this, that, and the other, and trying to make correlations with people and skull structures of things. It was hellish. So let's just go ahead and get into this, and we'll see all the differences and the things that have been added for all the way through this. There are some additions. Natufian culture is a late Epo-Paleolithic archaeological culture that existed from around 12,000 to 9,500 BC, or 13,000 to 750 BC, in the Levant area. So there was a slight shift there. The culture was unusual that it supported a sedentary or semi-sedentary population even before the introduction of agriculture. So in other words, they already had a place to stay constantly and were no longer roaming and hunter-gathering. Like people would think of the Indians and how they may have had teepees and stuff, but they followed the animals and did things constantly and may not pass this way again for a long time. These people were, at least for a large period of the year, and they've realized now, year-round, living in this area. You think of the area the way it looks now, though, and you'd say, well, it couldn't sustain something like that. Well, back then there weren't that many people, things were different, and that whole area was very lush and full of forests, woodlands and stuff. Steppe area out from there. We'll talk about that too when we get there. The Natufian culture communities may be the ancestors of the builders of the very first Neolithic settlements of the region, which may have been the earliest in the world. The Natufians found the settlement where Jericho is today, Jericho of the Bible, which may therefore be the longest continuous inhabited urban area on Earth. And for a long time it was considered the first city on Earth. Some evidence suggests deliberate cultivation of cereal plants, grains, specifically rye, by the area on Earth. Some evidence suggests deliberate cultivations of the Natufians at Tel Abu Harera, the site of earliest evidence of agriculture in the world. I almost double spoke that, sorry. So we'll look at Abu Harera, and well, they're not going to show it to you, but you see the Tigris and Euphrates coming here, and Abu Harera is hooked up to Tigris right in this region. A lot of people think Sumerians are all right here, but of course, way up in here were still cities. They're very famous, and of the earliest of cities of the Sumerians. But, well, I guess a better look at it is right here. That shows here, Abu Harera is right here. Interestingly, it shows here, but also it's on the map showing the Younger Dryas event, which they have correlated to this, which we're talking about in a minute. And this is the farthest extent where they have found the microspherules and all the things that are associated with it spilling out over on this side of the world. I have a video coming where on the other side of the world they have found it in 3 more places other than the ones they already had. And so it's really pinpointing it down, and now people that were really going against the idea are having to kind of lean that way, and one wonders how long or how much more you would have to prove the Younger Dryas event having been of somewhat of its magnitude that we thought of, there's been a hard fight versus it. So, let me get this back over right. Yeah. So, earliest site of agriculture in the world. There's some contest to that too, believe it or not. But we'll get there in other videos, and we've already actually talked about it in other videos. The world's oldest evidence of bread making has been found at Shubaka 1, a 14,500-year-old site in Jordan's northeast desert. In addition, the oldest known evidence of beer, dating to approximately 13,000 years before present, or 11,000 years ago, they were making a cultured beer. It was found at Rocket Cave in Mount Carmel near Haifa in Israel. Damn, I like caramel. Y'all like caramel? Caramel's good stuff. Generally, though, Natufians exploited wild cereals, animals hunted, including gazelles. According to Christy G. Turner, it's a male with that name, though, there are archaeological and physical anthropological evidence for relationships between the modern Semitic-speaking populations of the Levant and some of the speaking Levant and the Natufians. Archaeogenetics have revealed derivation of later Neolithic to Bronze Age Levantines primarily from Natufians, besides substantial admixture from Chalcolithic Anatolians. And so if we look about ancient Hattusians and the people of Troy and all the stuff that goes on there, and Greeks and stuff that work into that, they're talking about that. So even though people develop different cultures, they're telling you where all this comes from and what all of it hooks up to. So we're actually talking about pre-proto-Phoenicians, which Phoenicians called themselves Canaan. So there's your Canaanite type people, and it encompasses that whole area and a whole lot more eventually, for they get all these places where they're going. But in a time whenever we look back at, people weren't doing much. They had incredible boats like the Vikings, and they were the merchants of old, going all over the places. There's a reason for that too, and I've got another video that I'm going to release before this comes out, relating the Phoenicians and ancient Irish and Berbers and all types of things together in another connection set of videos. But that's another thing. Dorothy Garrod coined the term ancient Natufian based on her excavations at Shabka Cave, which is Wadi al-Natif, in the Judean mountains, and so that's roughly where it gets its name from. Here's a picture of her. In fact, let's look at it closer, and you can see how dark this woman is from being out in the sun for so long there working on this site. In fact, the people around her are the ethnics that are living there, and I swear she's got to be the darkest one, at least as dark as this lady that's here. And but boy, her legs are pale, but I bet those are stockings. So let's go back. The Natufian culture was discovered by British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod during her excavations at Shubka Cave in the Judean Hills in the west bank of the Jordan River. Prior to the 1930s, the majority of archaeological work taking place in the British Palestine was biblical archaeology, focused on historic periods, and little was known about the region's prehistory. Okay, and everything really back in this time, everybody was trying to prove the Bible and verify it and everything kept showing us other things, like dinosaurs and a lot of other things. So, little was known about prehistory, though, but in 1928, she was invited to the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem, called BSAJ, to excavate Shabka Cave, where prehistoric stone tools had been found by a French priest named Alex Malin 4 years earlier. She discovered a layer sandwiched between the Upper Paleolithic and Bronze Age deposits, characterized by the presence of microliths. So this is basically stone tools working to try to make points and try to make things out of, and cutting devices, microliths, stone tools. She identified this with the Mesolithic era, a transitional period between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. Okay, we know our little micro eras right here going through, and what people have called them. Of course, periods of time have changed since I was a kid too on what they date when, especially the Iron Age. But it was the Paleolithic and Neolithic was well represented in Europe, but had not yet been found in the Near East. And there's a reason for that. And of course, everybody thinks it flips the other way, but aha. I have some videos going out that show you the aha. And I have a lot that I've already put out. So, a year later, when she discovered similar material at Wattle Terrace, Garrod suggested the name for the Natufian culture after Wadi Natuf that ran close to that place of Shudka Cave. Over the next 2 decades, Garrod found Natufian material at several of her pioneering excavations in the Mount Carmel region, including El Wad Kabera, which we're going to talk about in another video coming soon, for it's a predating culture, and Taboun, as did the French archaeologist René Noville, firmly establishing the Natufian culture in the region's prehistoric chronology. As early as 1931, both Garrod and Noville drew attention to the presence of stone sickles in the Natufian assemblages and the possibility that this represented early agriculture. And of course it did. In fact, there's been people that have looked under these things under special microscopes, and they can tell that they were used, and they took and made things that were just like it and sliced it through grains, and they go, oh, that's what causes the glazing on here and the look that it has. And they were already chopping off grain. But could they say that they were farming at this point? Well, they can't find a farm. They don't find any things that are associated with it, but it would look like that at this time people were doing all the farming, but they had already started domesticating animals long before this. And so is that really an effect? Things will change over time for that. Whenever I was studying in it, I thought I was a pioneer, knowing that before the Egyptians there were the Sumerians, and a lot of their stuff, and they popcorn out of nowhere, man, they got all this crap, and they predate them, and then there's mastabas, and that's what starts out Egypt and all those things I've talked about. But popcorn out of nowhere, no, it ain't popcorn out of nowhere. And there are pieces of stuff that goes back in history, but now we're starting to figure out the connections that we never did before, and genetics is revealing that, and we're going to get to genetics here shortly. Radiocarbon dating places the Natufian culture at an epoch from the terminal Pleistocene to the very beginning of the Holocene, a time period between 12,500 ding and 9,500 BC. But the period is commonly split also into 2 subperiods, early Natufian and late Natufian. The late Natufian most likely occurred in tandem with the Younger Dryas event at 10,800 to 9,500 BC. You see some weird numbers on Younger Dryas sometimes. They floated around just a hair in a couple of hundred years. But regardless, the Levant hosts more than 100 kinds of cereals, fruits, nuts, and other edible parts of plants, and the flora of the Levant during the Natufian period was not only the dry, barren, and thorny landscape of today, but rather woodlands and quite lush. And in fact, you can tell in the old Bible stories about the great cedar forest of Lebanon and all these things they have in there that only patches of exist anymore. I've talked about this quite a bit, where they were running all the way up through the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and all the way around and in between the two, which looks like a desert now, and all the way down in Egypt where there were sycamores and yew trees, and they have all their statues made out of them and stuff, with those crystal blue eyes I've shown, and that's yew wood, the same sacred wood of the Druids, along with oaks and sycamore, ash. Why I keep telling you these things keep going with things of my childhood. In a second, we're going to talk about how these people were these people that took their front 2 teeth out. Okay? Well, here's something personal. My dad had a problem with his front 2 teeth, and there was a gapping, but they were close at the top but starting to gap, and they said that there was a problem with one of his roots, and they could do this whole little thing, but they probably ought to pull them, and that would allow him to have his wisdom teeth in without any problems and blah, 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 which actually was the effect. But he ended up getting a retainer with two fake teeth onto it. It looked pretty real. And I remember it being when we were a kid, when I first studied these things about these Natufian people and stuff, and found out that they ain't got no toothus in the front, and they are the Natufian people. I asked my dad about it, and I remember it being around Christmas time, and I believe Mom was making her famous tacos, and called in to eat and everything, and I asked Dad if he was, showed him a picture of some skull that they had there where they missing the two front teeth. There's a lot of them through all of this. And asked him if he was Natufian. Ha ha, little do you know, whenever once I go through studying all this stuff, it's probably more like, than, yeah, it's probably got something to do with it. But also, I remember saying something, and it was, of course, at Christmas, but all I want for Christmas is my two front teeth. Yeah, I get that. So now we're going to talk about precursors and what upcoming video is going to be about. But I've already talked about them once. Well, why not some more? And in the other video, I'm going to link two of my old videos that were real popular together. Kamyana Mohila and the first description of Sumerian gods and things, and people riding horses at 22,000 BC and things, but also the very first writing. And it's been shown there it's a hidden type concept, and how they hook up to these people that we call the Kabarans. The Natufians developed in the same region as the early Kabaran industry. It is generally seen as a successor after that, which evolved out of elements within that preceding culture. There were also other industries in the region, such as Mashabian culture and the Negev of the Sinai, which are sometimes distinguished from the Kabaran or believed to have been involved in the evolution of the Natufian. A Tanaka. More generally, there have been discussions of the similarities of these cultures with those found in coastal North Africa. Graham Barker notes that there are similarities in the respective archaeological records of the Natufian culture of the Levant and of contemporary foragers in coastal North Africa across the late Pleistocene and early Holocene boundary. According to Isabel de Groot, Louise Humphrey, Natufians practiced Ibo-Mauritanian and Capasian, my God, I'm going to say it again, Ibo-Mauritanian and Capsian custom of sometimes extracting their maxillary central incisors or front upper teeth. And here's a little description of that where they pull their two front upper teeth out. Right? And it's thought that what they do it for is so that they will have the ability to have their molars come in, and somebody's prophesied that they perhaps had some problems with that. They pull their teeth, it gives them enough room for them to grow in, then they don't have abscesses, and a lot of people don't die at 20 years old because back then they didn't have nothing. It's a way around it. But then they apparently built it into their culture somewhat for a little while. Oh, I also remember calling it reverse rabbit. A rabbit's got two big front teeth, and then these guys are like reverse rabbit. And they all this grains and stuff that goes with it. Anyhow, Ofer Bar Yosef has argued that there are signs of influences coming from North Africa to the Levant, citing the microburin technique and the microlithic forms, such as arch-backed bladelets, and known in Lahula, and their type of points. But recent research has shown that the presence of arch-backed bladelets, La Mahula points, and the use of microburin technique was already apparent in the Nabatean industry of the eastern Levant. And Mayer and others state that many technological nuances that have been always highlighted as significant during the Natufians were already present during the early and middle Upper Paleolithic, and do not in most cases represent a radical departure in knowledge, tradition, or behavior. I know that's a long statement, but basically they're saying, no, some of this neat stuff that we just now are finding out that these people had that are incredible, the people before them had it. and they already had it. So they were, well, did they perfect it? There you go. There's another way of looking at things. And sometimes they say, well, it goes here, and then they realized, well, no, they had it at first, but now it's going on real good, and these people did it better. And you would think it would go along those lines. Let's continue. Oh, I want to show you something, what they call the Levant. And it's kind of telling here. For whenever you first look at it here, it's up top. You see the dark green area, and that's what we do call the Levant, although they contain the island that's out there of it, but also contain with the concept of Levant nowadays. It's spreading with what cultures and things like that were really there, ho ho. And so you see that green form of all of the Sumerian area, if you will, of the Tigris and Euphrates, but also the delta leading into Egypt, and then that avocado green that's all of Anatolia and Greece there, but also Libya and all of Egypt. Interesting. So this Kabaran culture that it came out of, and by the way, this is just one look at some things. These are all these well-used forms of grain smashers and things to end up making wheat and stuff into bread right here. And while a lot of them look pretty ancient or whatever, the amazing thing that you would see out of this is look at this bowl and how cool that looks compared to the other things that you're looking at. Oh, and what you're not seeing is this right behind it. For that outclasses all of these artifacts so weirdly. It's not even funny. It's like a spaceman showed up and gave him a cup. This is made out of an extremely hard stone. I think it's 6 or 7 on the mole scale. But it's also made, it's a perfect circle, carved out, inner thin line going all the way down and everything. Not your common mortar and pestle. We'll look at a few things like that again. But if you've looked at some of the earliest artifacts of the Naqada periods leading into the very first dynastic Egyptians, which he's going to refer to here shortly as being coming from out of those Caucasian Natufians, and the connections, and he will verify what I've been talking about for quite a long time. And you'll see objects that out of nowhere seem to be very advanced compared to the scale of the other things they're making. Oh, that's pretty cool. They're boring holes and stuff and making stones that exactly fit it so they can put stone in there, or put seed in there and shuck, and make bread out of it. It's amazing. My mom had a mortar and pestle made out of volcanic rock that was from Mexico itself or whatever, but it was really just looking like a mortar and pestle, and we tried to make guacamole with the thing over and over again, but it was a mess, and she had to hand clean it, and when she could hand clean it, she had to take like a toothbrush to it and scrub it all out and all these types of things. Anyhow, it was really something that was more decorative but also usable. And it was like a black volcanic rock with little white chips all in it. It's pretty cool. Anyhow, authors such as Christopher Ehret have built upon the little evidence available to develop scenarios of intensive usage of plants, having built up first in North Africa as a precursor to the development of true farming in the Fertile Crescent. But such suggestions are considered highly speculative until more North African archaeological evidence can be gathered. In fact, Weiss and others have shown that the earliest known intensive usage of plants was in the Levant 23,000 years ago at the Ohalo II site, which we'll talk about in the other video, but also how that would have been the other way. And if we look at Göbekli Tepe and all the cultures that come out of that in Catalhoyuk, we can kind of understand that. And the first people, whenever I thought that we were on the cutting edge of Sumerians, knowing that they were the first people that have cultured agriculture. And in fact, the earliest grains that we find are already quite manipulated, and they had domesticated them, along with some animals. like popcorn I talked about. Boom, out of nowhere, right? So 23,000. So I think that it's kind of like checkmate. Until you pull a better card out. Anthropologist C. Loring Brace in 1993, which I talked about before, cross-analyzed the craniometric traits of the Natufian specimens with those of very ancient and modern groups from the Near East, Africa, and Europe. The late Pleistocene epilithic Natufian sample was described as problematic due to its smaller size, consisting of only 3 males and 1 female. In other words, they didn't have enough of a group to say that this was actually the holotype of what was going on, but yeah, if you use it, here's what we got, right? As well as the lack of comparative samples from the Natufians' putative descendants in the Neolithic Near East at the time. Brace observed that the Natufian fossils lay between those of the Niger-Congo-speaking populations and other samples, which he suggested may point to a sub-Saharan influence in their constitution. Subsequent ancient DNA analysis of Natufian skeleton samples remains by Lazardus and others in 2016 found that the specimens incest were a mix of 50% basal Eurasian ancestral component, see genetics below, which we will, and 50% Western Eurasian unknown hunter-gatherers, known as UHG, population unrelated to European Western, or population that is related to European Western hunter-gatherers. Ding. According to Bar Yosef and Bel Cohen, it seems that certain pre-adaptive traits developed already by the Kabaran and geometric Kabaran populations, and that geometric Kabaran is a pretty cool population. It's slightly variation different, like the other guys that came through, and it's something we'll get into in the next video that I do on it. I'll plan on doing it fairly soon. Within the Mediterranean park forest, they call it, they played an important role in the emergence of the new socio-economic systems that became known as the Natufian culture. And when you look at something like this, you say, okay, well, I'm looking at American Indians, right? And they got feathers in their hair and everything. No, this is a Caucasian, and even though she's got dark hair, she can have light hair and light hair traits too. Well, I'll be damned, it looks just like American Indians. Well, this is about the level that American Indians were at, and so they really didn't adapt much more off when they came into the Americas over the period of time from the time that they did till now. That's somewhat telling, but they did somewhat, but people think they had horses and all these other things. That came from the Spaniards coming in and so on too. So it's kind of telling, isn't it? That's what their homes would have looked like. An easy way to make them. And it kind of lets you wonder, maybe these people went around and the proto-Indians, before they went across the bridge, had contact with these people, which I've shown in videos and talked about quite a few times. And whenever you look at something like that, you can go, well, oh, that's where the Indians got it from. One could think it could go the other way, but seeing what happened in the after effect, one would probably be able to realize the other. Settlements occur in the woodland belt where oak and piscata specimens dominated. And that's pistachia, by the way. Yeah, okay. The underbrush of this open woodland was grass with high frequencies of grain. The high mountains of Lebanon and anti-Lebanon, the steppe areas of the Negev desert in Israel and Sinai, and the Syro-Arabian desert in the east were much less favored for Natufian settlements, presumably due to both their lower carrying capacity and the company of other groups of foragers who exploited this region, perhaps. The habitations, we'll get to later while that comes into effect. The habitations of Natufians were semi-subterranean, often with a dry stone foundation. The superstructure was probably made of brushwood. No traces of mud brick have been found. which became common in the following pre-pottery Neolithic A group. So shortly after that, but these people are already sedentary, and then they started making permanent homes. This is kind of the joke of whenever you talk about the three little pigs and how they started out with a brush type thing, then they end up going to wood type houses and this, and then after that, they went to stone or brick. Round houses have a diameter between 3 and 6 meters, and they contain a central round or sub-rectangular fireplace. And circular form of houses come from this date to way past it and get nicer, where we find things like yurts and so on. But then whenever we do stonework, you can't make round as good as you can make squared off blocks, and then behold, people square the circle. And this is the houses we live in today, and the reason it's squared off. For it's a different thing than a little round coracle look. Right? In Ain Mahala, traces of post holes have been identified. Villages can cover over 1,000 square meters. Small settlements have been interpreted by some researchers as camps. Traces of rebuilding in almost all excavated settlements seem to point to a frequent relocation, indicating a temporary abandonment of the settlement. Settlements have been estimated to house 100 to 150 people, but there are three categories: small, medium, and large, ranging from 15 square meters to 1,000 square meters. And there are no definite indications of storage facilities, right? So it may have gone on for some time, but they don't have a granary and things set up. Lithics. The Natufian had a microlithic industry centered on short blades and bladelets. The microburin technique was used. Geometric megaliths include lunates, trapezes, and triangles. These are backed blades as well. A special type of retouch, or Helwan retouch, is characteristic for the early Natufian period. And this is when I told you people used to argue about stone blades and pottery and crap. In the late Natufian, the harif point, a typical arrowhead made from a regular blade, became common in the Negev. Some scholars use it to define a separate culture, the Harafian. And this is what I was talking about. Sickle blades also appear for the first time in the Natufian lithic industry. Characteristic sickle gloss shows that they were used to cut the silica-rich stems of cereals. I told you about that earlier. Indirectly suggesting that the existence of incipient agriculture. Shaft straighteners made of ground stone indicate practice of archery. There's already heavy ground stone bowl mortars as well, and we'll look at some of those in a minute. This picture you're looking at over at the right is the first depiction of humans in coitus, if you will. And in fact, they talk about that in art. The Ain Sakari Lovers, they're called, is a stone object at the British Museum. It's the oldest known depiction of a couple making love. It is found in the Ain Sakari cave in the Judean desert. Burials. Natufian grave goods are typically made of shell, teeth of red deer, quite often, bones and stone. There are pendants, bracelets, necklaces, earrings, and bell ornaments as well. In 2008, the 12,400 to 12,000-year-old calibrated BC grave of an apparently significant Natufian female was discovered in a ceremonial pit in the Halazon Tachet cave in northern Israel. Media reports refer to this person as a shaman. The burial contained remains of at least 3 aurochs and 86 tortoises, all of which were thought to have been brought to the site during a funeral feast. The body was surrounded by tortoise shells, the pelvis of a leopard, forearm of wild boar, wing tip of a golden eagle, and skull of a stone marten were found in the burial with her. And stone marten, if you look at this thing, it's a weasel type thing, right? And so you look at some of these burials, and they've got this intricate shell headpiece that's done on them, right? They're swathed in red ochre. Here's another picture of a schematic of a human that's put in the burial. It's a symbolic set, and you see this same type of thing later in the Phoenicians and their pictographic drawings of such things as Tanit and others. Long distance exchange. At El Mahain in northern Israel, Anatolian obsidian and shellfish from the Nile Valley have been found. The source of malachite beads is still unknown. Malachite's a green colored stone. But beads, we've talked about that before. The first people who have started making beads, and then you start finding it in Egypt, and of course extreme industry in that going a little bit later. And you wonder why? Well, I'll tell you shortly. Epipaleolithic Natufians carried parthenocarpic figs from Africa to the southeast corner of the Fertile Crescent. And this is that Johnny Appleseed moment that I've told you about. And when we talk about them taking parthenocarpic figs, when we talk about the Phoenicians and how that relates to date palm trees and so on, and the birth of a people in a way from something that had happened before, but they were devastated, like an Atlantean tale, it somewhat makes sense. 10,000 BC. There was a rich bone industry, including harpoons and fishhooks. Stones and bone were used into pendants and other ornaments. There's a few human figurines made out of limestone. But the favorite subject of representative art seems to have been animals. Ostrich shell containers have been found in the Negev, and I showed a couple of these in videos that I have where they've done things out of ostrich shell. In fact, one of the famous very first maps was two ostrich shells, and they took the pointier end off of each one and kept the round and put those two round ones together and made a map. It's incredible. In 2018, the world's oldest brewery was found with a residue of 13,000-year-old beer in a prehistoric cave near Haifa in Israel. Researchers were looking for clues into what plant foods the Natufian people were eating. This is 8,000 years earlier than experts previously thought beer was invented by the Sumerians, pretty much. And this puts it at, rather than 5,000, 13,000. Archaeology rarely makes jumps like that, guys, but all it takes is something that old and in your face, and then there's no denying it. A study published in 2019 shows an advanced knowledge of lime plaster production at a Natufian cemetery in Nahal Ingev 2 site in the upper Jordan Valley, dated to 12,000 calibrated years before the present. 9,000 BC. Production of plaster of this quality was previously thought to have been achieved some 2,000 years later. Well, actually, it was 4,500 years later, and then recently got updated to 2,000, and they thought, oh my God, and then these people just went, hold my beer. No pun intended. Where are we at? 38? I'll still get this in. The Natufian people lived by hunting and gathering, but they had a sedentary life. But then again, so did Ma and Pa out in the Old West. So what are we talking about? The preservance of plant remains is poor because of the soil conditions, but wild cereals, legumes, almonds, acorns, pistachios have been collected. Animal bone shows that gazelles were the main prey. Additional deer, aurochs, and wild boar, the satyr people here, were hunted in the steppe zone, as well as onagers, which is a primordial donkey, and caprids, which are ibex. Waterfowl and freshwater fish form part of the diet in the Jordan River Valley. Animal bones from Salabia from 12,300 to 10,800 calendar years before present have been interpreted as evidence for communal hunts with nets. However, the radiocarbon dates are far too old compared to the cultural remains of the settlement, indicating the contamination of the samples. But also showing you that radiocarbon date is showing what? That's one that gets ruined, doesn't it, guys? Development of agriculture. Pita-like bread has been found from 12,500 BC, attributed to Natufians. This bread is made of wild cereal, seeds, and papyrus cousin, I don't know what that is, tubers ground into flour. Now, whenever I talked about the ancient Sumerians, and I talk about they had the ancient tales that they say, whenever it starts out the ancient tale, it tells you that it happened long, long ago. And what that really means, for then later they tell you before bread was even formed, before bread was cooked, before this, before that, well, and long before that, and you're like, what the hell are you talking about? Well, to then it seemed like, oh man, this must have been 7,000 years ago. Now you look at it here, and these people of the time had known what had happened in ancient times, and they're telling you long before bread was first made, all these things happened. Well, in that series of stories, I tell you the story of the ancient flood that happened. So not only was there one there, and a great cataclysm that happened, but it happened again later. This is the reality, not the biblical story, but that's what it is. According to one theory, it was a sudden change in climate. The Younger Dryas event, ding, at 10,800 to 9,500 BC, which inspired the development of agriculture. The Younger Dryas was a 1,000-year-long interruption of the high temperatures prevailing of the last glacial maximum, which produced a sudden drought in the Levant. This would have endangered the wild cereals, which could no longer compete with dry land scrub, but upon the population had become dependent to sustain relatively large sedentary population. By artificially clearing scrub and planting seeds obtained from elsewhere, they began to practice agriculture as we know it today. However, this theory of the origin of agriculture is controversial in the scientific community. Oh boy. So we can look at these old mortar and pestle and stuff like this, and grinding tools from Gilgal, and that looks like a pizza and pizza plate. But then we have sharpening stones. Now that's for sharpening blades and stuff, and why would they have no? What the hell are you talking about? And they seem to be held in a certain way, either a handheld version or a version that you might have somebody put both hands around while the other person does it, or you put it between your feet. But they also have a bone-rimmed dagger here that they have made out in Natufian culture, right? So you see these stone mortars and everything, and now you go, well, that's not that fancy and everything. Hold on a second, because we were talking about those cool bowls a minute ago. Well, look what this is. Look how fine that's made, the way the lip is made and the rim on that thing, and the perfect structure, the way it tapers down and it has the foot set to it and everything. Doesn't that look like the cup of Christ in the Indiana Jones movie a little bit? It's got a gold insert, which it kind of looks like it does a little. Damn if this lighter didn't work. And that one either. There we go. Gotta shake it. Must be going out. Look at the quality of that. Well, a couple of thousand years later than there, all these people are making a bunch of this stuff that they've kept for thousands of years, and then they ceremoniously start off Egypt with it. Aha. There you go. Ding. Domesticated dog. Let's get there, and then we're going to go into genetics, I guess, in second part here. And I hated to go, man. Domesticated dog. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence for the domestication of the dog comes from the Natufian sites. At the Natufian site of Aun Melaya, Israel, dated to 12,000 BC, the remains of an elderly human and a 4 to 5 month old puppy were found buried together. At another Natufian site at the cave of Hoyonim, humans were found buried with 2 dogs. But it looks like that culturing of dogs came from the culture before this that I have an upcoming video about. And they talk about it in there too. And I did a video last year when a friend of mine's dog died and talk about it and how they were already the earliest that we find them, and then we talk about it